In the night terminal outside Chicago,
I have
Mason Carter
to get
wanted
on
nothing
this
more than
train.
to sit quietly, sleeve low
Almost
over his
there.
wrist, clutching the last ticket to the
No
hospital
time
where
to
his daughter
waste.
waited for surgery. Then Logan Hunter, head of a dirty money crew, stepped close, pressed a pistol against his ribs beneath a folded coat, and forced him to give up his seat before everyone. Mason rose without a word, without resistance.
Còn bao
As he
lâu
lifted
nữa?
his bag, his sleeve
Tôi không
slid
biết.
back, revealing a faded
có
Black
giỡn mặt
Ops
với
mark
tao.
on his wrist.
Tôi đang hợp
Logan
tác.
went pale as sudden death. The whole car fell silent.
Đừng
If
làm
you
gì
want to
ngu
know
ngốc,
exactly why
hoặc
that
con mày sẽ
gangster
chết.
feared the mark on his wrist,
Bỏ
stay
tôi
with this
xuống,
whole
từ
story.
từ.
The Chicago terminal was nearly empty past midnight, its high windows streaked with rain that fell in long silver lines under the sodium lights.
Hãy bình tĩnh.
A tired
Tôi không muốn
announcement
rắc rối.
echoed through the concourse, calling out the final train of the night, the last one bound for Cleveland before the schedule went dark until morning. Footsteps scattered across the wet platform, hurried and few, and somewhere a vending machine hummed against the quiet like the only living thing left awake in the building. Mason Carter moved through that quiet without drawing a single glance. He wore a coat that had seen too many winters, carried a canvas bag with a frayed strap, and walked with the particular tiredness of a man who had worked through several nights in a row without complaint. He was not traveling for pleasure, and he was not traveling for work. He was traveling because a hospital 200 miles east needed his signature before dawn, a signature that would allow surgeons to open his daughter's chest and fix what medicine alone could not. The girl herself never appeared in the story that followed. She existed instead in fragments, carried quietly in Mason's pocket and in the back of his mind. A text message from the hospital confirming the operating time, a small plastic patient bracelet tucked inside his wallet beside an old photograph, and a phone call from a night nurse that would last only seconds before the signal on the train gave out. Those fragments were enough. They were the only reason Mason existed inside this story at all. 2 rows behind him, in the same business class car, sat Amelia Grace, a finance executive returning from a long and exhausting week spent untangling an internal investigation into money laundering that had touched her own company from the inside. She noticed Mason almost immediately, the way she noticed anything unusual in a room out of professional habit, though she assumed at first he was simply a poor and exhausted man trying to get somewhere important. Farther back, boarding without hurry and without suspicion, came Logan Hunter and 3 men who worked for him, blending into the sparse crowd of late travelers. They carried financial records, hard currency, and evidence meant to disappear from the city entirely before sunrise. Nothing about their clothing or their posture marked them as dangerous, which was exactly the point. Mason chose a seat near the emergency exit, not for comfort but out of an old habit he had never managed to unlearn. Always know where the door is, always hear the footsteps before they arrive, always keep the distance measured. He pulled his right sleeve down over his wrist, covering an old tattoo that ordinary people would never recognize, though certain men in certain circles still spoke of it the way people speak of curses. Mason did not want to fight. He did not want to be recognized. He wanted only to reach the hospital before morning. Outside the window, the city lights slid past in long blurred streaks, and Mason let his forehead rest briefly against the cool glass, closing his eyes for a moment before opening them again to resume his quiet habitual watch over the car. He had learned, long before any of this, that rest and vigilance could occupy the same body at once, that a person could look almost peaceful while still tracking every sound around him. The train pulled away from the platform with a low groan of metal, and the car settled into a stillness that felt heavier than ordinary quiet. Amelia Grace kept glancing toward Mason without meaning to. He sat too straight, his back barely touching the cushion, and his eyes kept flicking to the reflection in the dark window the way a person watches a mirror for someone sneaking up behind them. She wondered briefly if he was former military, then dismissed the thought, since his coat and his silence suggested a man worn down by something far more ordinary than war. Logan Hunter moved through the aisle like a man who already owned the car, though he was neither loud nor visibly armed. He was not drunk and he did not raise his voice, yet something in the way he carried himself made strangers lower their eyes without being told to. He had a soft, unhurried way of speaking that somehow made it worse. The seat Mason occupied happened to sit exactly where Logan wanted one of his own men positioned, close to the emergency exit and angled toward the luggage compartment where a duffel bag holding the crew's most important cargo had been hidden. Logan approached and told Mason, quietly but with unmistakable weight, to get up and give the seat to someone else. Mason declined politely, explaining that he needed to be near the door because he would be getting off at the next stop to reach a hospital. He kept his voice even, almost apologetic, the tone of a man trying to avoid trouble rather than provoke it. Logan smiled the thin smile of someone unused to being told no and decided the tired-looking man in the worn coat was not worth taking seriously. Jackson Reed, his closest enforcer, stepped in behind him and shoved his shoulder hard against Mason's on the way past, testing how far the stranger could be pushed before he pushed back. Mason did not react. He simply rested one hand against his canvas bag where the hospital papers were folded inside and said nothing at all. There was an unfairness building in the scene that the other passengers could feel without understanding it fully. A man already carrying more weight than anyone around him could imagine was now being humiliated in front of strangers for refusing to abandon the one thing that mattered. Amelia noticed Logan's hand slide beneath the edge of his jacket and recognized, with a small cold jolt, the outline of a weapon. Logan pressed the barrel lightly against Mason's side, hidden from most of the car by the angle of his coat, and told him again, this time without any pretense of asking, to stand. Mason rose slowly, not out of fear but because his mind had already begun cataloging every exit, every angle, every person within reach. As he lifted his bag from the floor, his sleeve slipped down an inch, just enough to reveal the edge of the tattoo etched into the skin near his wrist. For one long second, nothing happened. Then Logan's eyes fixed on the mark and something in his face changed completely, the practiced calm of a career criminal giving way, however briefly, to something closer to fear. Logan stared at the mark as though he had seen something rise up out of the past itself. It was not a large tattoo, not the kind meant to be shown off or admired. It was a small, dark symbol set close against the pulse of the wrist, faded from years of hiding beneath sleeves and gloves, the sort of thing an ordinary observer would walk past without noticing at all. Jackson had no idea what was happening and kept barking at Mason to get down onto the floor, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred beside him. Logan grabbed his arm and pulled him back, and for the first time since boarding the train, the man who ran the operation lost his composure in front of his own crew. Amelia watched the exchange closely and understood, faster than anyone else in the car, that the tired man in the worn coat was not what he appeared to be. Another passenger nearby felt the same shift in the air without being able to name it, the strange sensation of watching a man holding a gun suddenly become afraid of a man holding nothing at all. Mason pulled his sleeve back down over his wrist and told Logan, calmly and without threat in his voice, that he did not want any trouble. It was not a plea. It carried the flat, quiet weight of a warning, the kind a person only earns the right to give after living through things that leave marks behind. Logan took half a step back and asked, in a voice much smaller than the one he had used moments earlier, where Mason had served. Mason did not answer directly. He only said that he had left that life behind a long time ago and had no intention of returning to it. Logan's mind went somewhere years in the past, to a rumor that circulated in certain corners of the underworld about a Black Ops unit that had dismantled an entire weapons pipeline running through the Balkans. Nobody involved in that world knew the real names of the men in that unit. What they knew was that the sole survivor carried a mark like the one Mason had just revealed. Logan had lost his own brother in that operation years before, a fact that still sat in his chest like a stone he had never managed to put down. Yet he also remembered, or believed he remembered, that one nameless operator had spared his own life that night simply because he had been too young at the time to be holding a weapon. He did not know for certain whether Mason was that same man, but instinct, older and more honest than pride, told him to be afraid regardless. Jackson, unwilling to let the moment pass without reasserting his own authority, yanked the canvas bag from Mason's hands and sent the hospital documents scattering across the floor of the car. Amelia caught sight of the surgical consent forms among the papers and understood at once why Mason needed that particular seat, why he needed to be near that door, why every minute of this delay mattered more to him than any of them could know. Mason knelt and gathered the papers without striking anyone, without raising his voice, and that restraint unsettled Logan even further. The most dangerous man on the train, it was becoming clear, was also the calmest one in it. The scene closed with a message reaching Logan's phone from one of his men further down the car, warning him that a federal officer might be riding among the passengers that night. The story widened beyond a simple argument over a seat. Logan was not merely bullying passengers for sport. He was using the overnight train as cover to move financial evidence out of Chicago before investigators could close in on his operation. Amelia Grace was not on that train by accident either. Her own company had once been used, without her knowledge at the time, as a shell for laundering transactions that Logan's network controlled from behind several layers of shell corporations. Tucked inside her bag, Amelia carried an encrypted drive containing evidence capable of bringing down dozens of officials and criminals connected to the scheme. Logan did not yet know the drive was sitting only a few feet away from him, but he knew, from a tip passed along earlier that week that someone on this train was carrying exactly what he needed to make disappear. Elijah Brooks, a federal officer traveling undercover as an ordinary passenger, tried quietly to reach his support team through a small earpiece, only to find the train's signal jammed somewhere along the route. Jackson noticed the unusual device tucked in Elijah's ear and grew suspicious almost immediately, watching him with the particular hunger of a man eager to prove his usefulness. Logan ordered the connecting doors between cars sealed, turning the business class section into a controlled space cut off from the rest of the train. He announced, calmly and without raising his voice, that phones were to be put away and that no one was permitted to leave their seat. Mason could have acted the moment the doors sealed, but he held back, aware of everything working against a hasty move. Too many innocent passengers crowded into a narrow space, at least 3 armed men working together, weapons already pointed toward people who had done nothing wrong, and a train moving at speed with nowhere safe to fall. Instead, Mason shifted into an old and familiar mode of watching rather than acting. He counted weapons, studied the particular way each man handled his gun, noted the location of the nearest camera, the position of the emergency brake, and the small telltale tremor in Jackson's trigger hand that suggested inexperience beneath the bravado. Amelia began to understand that Mason's stillness was not surrender at all, but something closer to a skill honed over years of surviving situations far worse than this one. Logan forced Elijah to stand and searched him, uncovering the federal badge hidden beneath his jacket. Panic rippled through the car in a wave that no one bothered to hide. Jackson wanted to fire a shot into Elijah right then, hoping to frighten the rest of the passengers into silence, but Mason spoke a single quiet sentence that stopped him cold. That firing a weapon inside a sealed car at this speed might not leave Elijah the first person to die. Mason was right about the angle of the shot, the way reinforced glass could throw a bullet back into the very space it was fired from, and the danger of ricochet in a space this narrow. Logan grew more certain by the second that Mason had once belonged to something far more specialized than an ordinary soldier's life. The section closed with Logan changing his plan entirely. He was no longer thinking only of escape. He was now thinking of using every passenger in that car as a hostage. Mason found himself pulled into a conflict that lived entirely inside his own chest. He had the ability to end the threat surrounding him in a matter of seconds. Yet if his old identity surfaced in front of witnesses and cameras, the quiet life he had built for himself and his daughter could unravel in ways no court would ever fully repair. In a brief memory that surfaced against his will, Mason recalled being part of a unit that handled missions that officially never existed on any government record. During his final assignment, he had lost a close friend and teammate because of a political decision made far above his rank, one that had been buried and denied by everyone with the authority to admit it. After that, Mason walked away from that life entirely. He changed his name in every practical sense, cut every old connection, and became, in the years that followed, a quiet single father working nights to keep his daughter fed, housed, and eventually treated for an illness that refused to be ignored. He had promised himself he would never use those old skills again unless there was truly no other choice left. Somewhere in the middle of the standoff, a call came through from the hospital, cutting in and out through the jammed signal for only a few seconds before it failed completely. No child's voice appeared in the exchange, only the sound of a tired night nurse relaying an update, and Mason's own voice, quiet and steady, promising that he would arrive in time. That single sentence moved Amelia more than anything else she had witnessed that night. She understood, watching him, that Mason was not fighting for pride or reputation. He was fighting because someone far away was waiting for him to come home alive. Logan turned his attention toward Amelia next, demanding she hand over the bag he suspected held the missing evidence. Amelia refused, trying to hold on to the composure she had spent years perfecting in boardrooms, though her hands betrayed her with a visible tremor she could not fully hide. Mason placed himself between her and Jackson with a small, almost unnoticeable shift of his body, a movement subtle enough that it might have passed for accident, yet precise enough to close off the angle of attack completely. Logan caught the movement immediately and warned Mason not to interfere further. Mason answered simply that Logan was making everything far more complicated than it needed to be. The remark struck a nerve. Logan bristled at being lectured, in front of his own men, by a man dressed like someone who could barely afford the ticket in his pocket. He ordered Jackson to strike Mason, hoping violence would restore the authority he felt slipping away. Jackson swung first, a heavy, careless punch aimed at Mason's jaw. Mason stepped aside with barely any wasted motion, caught Jackson's wrist, and held it locked for only a second before Jackson dropped to his knees in obvious pain. Mason released him almost immediately afterward, as if still offering him one last chance to step back from what was coming. The rest of the car understood, in that single moment, that they had just watched a man take down a hardened criminal without appearing to move at all. Logan no longer harbored any doubt about the meaning of the mark on Mason's wrist. It was real, and it belonged to someone who had once made grown men in his world afraid to speak its name. Logan pulled Mason toward the small space between two cars to speak away from the other passengers, though his men still held weapons trained on everyone seated nearby. He asked, in a voice quieter than any he had used all night, whether Mason remembered an operation at the port in Varna years earlier. Mason said nothing at first, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker that told Logan he remembered every detail of that night with perfect and unwelcome clarity. Logan revealed that his older brother had once worked as a weapons courier connected to that very operation. That night, the entire crew involved had been wiped out almost completely, except for Logan himself, who survived only because one anonymous operator had chosen not to shoot him after seeing how young he was and realizing he had never actually raised his own weapon. Looking now at the mark on Mason's wrist, Logan understood with a kind of sick certainty that this might be the very man who had spared his life all those years ago. A tangled knot of feeling rose in Logan's chest. He hated the unit that had taken his brother and shattered the criminal family he had grown up inside. Yet he also owed his own survival to a man wearing that same symbol. And underneath both feelings sat something rawer and simpler, fear, because he understood exactly how quickly a person like Mason could end everything happening in this car. Mason told him quietly that the past mattered far less than the choice Logan was making right now, in this moment, about who he intended to become. Logan laughed, a bitter and hollow sound, and said that men like him did not get to turn around and walk back toward any other kind of life. While the two men spoke, Jackson searched Amelia's bag and found the encrypted drive she had been carrying. Amelia was dragged forward and made the primary hostage, since the data in her possession was enough to dismantle Logan's entire network from the inside out. Elijah, tied near the back of the car and bleeding from a cut along his temple, tried to signal to Mason that backup would be waiting to stop the train at the next station, though they needed more time to get into position. Mason understood immediately that if the train came to a stop with Logan still in control, hostages could be killed in the process of clearing an escape route. He began building a plan meant to neutralize the remaining men before the train ever reached that platform. His plan rested on three things: drawing Logan's attention backward into his own past long enough to create an opening, provoking Jackson into a reckless mistake born of impatience, and using the train's emergency brake and lighting system to create a window of darkness he could use to his advantage. He knew Jackson well enough to predict how the man would behave under pressure, since Jackson had always mistaken patience for weakness and had always been the first to move when his pride felt threatened. Mason intended to use that flaw the way a person uses a loose thread, pulling gently until the whole seam came apart. He also knew the layout of the car by heart now, every seat, every panel, every hinge on every door, because in the years since leaving that old life behind, he had never fully stopped noticing rooms the way he once had to for survival. Old habits, it seemed, did not disappear simply because a man wanted them to. The section closed with Logan turning the gun toward Amelia and ordering Mason to kneel on the floor in front of everyone, a final test to see whether the man behind the legend would truly bow. Mason lowered himself to his knees in front of Logan, and to the frightened passengers watching, it looked exactly like surrender. For Mason, the position offered something entirely different. From down there he could see clearly that Jackson's shoelace had come loose, that Logan's finger rested in the wrong place along the trigger guard, that one of the remaining men stood far too close to the automatic door at the end of the car, and that a fire extinguisher sat tucked beneath the seat just to his left. Amelia looked at Mason and understood, somehow, that he was not afraid, he was counting. Logan wanted Mason to confess out loud, in front of everyone, exactly who and what he was. Mason offered only that he had once worked in the kind of darkness most people never learn exists, and that now he was simply a father trying to reach a hospital. The sentence changed something in the passengers around them. Several of them stopped looking at Mason as a stranger and began, instead, to look at him as the only hope left in that car. Jackson's patience ran out first. He kicked the hospital documents scattered on the floor further away, sending pages skidding beneath the seats, a small cruelty meant only to remind Mason who held the power in the room. It was the worst mistake Jackson would make that night. Mason did not explode immediately, but something in his gaze turned cold in a way that Logan noticed and did not like. Logan told Jackson sharply to stop. Jackson ignored him. He bent down to grab the surgical consent papers, intending to tear them apart in front of Mason as a final act of humiliation. That was the moment Mason moved. He shifted his weight off one knee, yanked the strap of his own bag to send Jackson stumbling forward, and in the same motion released the pin on the fire extinguisher tucked beneath the seat. White foam burst across the narrow space, swallowing the car in a sudden blinding cloud. Mason never reached for a weapon and never intended to kill anyone. He struck instead at wrists, elbows, knees, and the small clusters of nerves that could drop a grown man without leaving him permanently harmed. One of Logan's men found his own arm locked against the metal frame of a seat. Another watched his weapon spin away beneath a table before he even understood what had happened to him. Jackson himself ended up subdued using nothing more than the belt around his own waist. Logan pulled Amelia backward through the settling fog, frightened now but still dangerous, still holding the one card that mattered most in the room. Mason stopped his advance there, because Logan still had a hostage in his grip, and there is a line even the most capable man does not cross when an innocent life hangs in the balance. Elijah, still bound near the back of the car, watched the entire sequence unfold in the space of a few heartbeats and understood, for the first time with total clarity, exactly what kind of man had been sitting quietly among the passengers all along. He had spent years chasing dangerous men for a living, and he had never once seen anyone move the way Mason moved, without wasted motion, without anger, without anything that resembled hesitation. The passengers nearest the fog said nothing at all, too stunned to speak, watching a man who moments earlier had been shoved and mocked now standing calmly amid three subdued men, as though the entire exchange had cost him no more effort than closing a door. The section closed on a standoff drawn tight as wire. Mason had taken down nearly the entire crew, yet Logan still held Amelia, and the drive that could end his empire remained clutched in his other hand. The lights along the ceiling flickered from the foam still settling across the car, casting the whole scene in an uneven, stuttering glow that made every movement look sharper than it was. Logan dragged Amelia backward toward the connecting door, trying to separate himself from the rest of the passengers before anyone could organize against him. He warned Mason to stay back, promising that Amelia would be shot the moment anyone came closer. Amelia, frightened but thinking clearly despite everything, had hidden the real drive inside the lining of her coat earlier that night, leaving only a decoy in the bag Logan now held. Mason caught the flicker in her eyes and understood immediately what she had done. The two of them had never met before that evening, yet somewhere in the chaos a silent trust had formed between them, the kind that sometimes grows fastest under the worst possible circumstances. Elijah tried to struggle free from his restraints, but his injuries slowed him enough that he could offer little more than a warning shout. Mason told Logan that he still had one option left: hand over the evidence, release the hostage, and live long enough to try rebuilding whatever remained of his life. For a brief moment, something in Logan wavered, pulled back toward the memory of the night Mason had once let him live. Jackson, still pinned to the floor by his own belt, shouted that Logan would lose everything if he surrendered now, that there was no version of this night that ended with him walking free. The shout snapped Logan back into fury. He pulled Amelia toward a maintenance door near the end of the car, intending to jump once the train slowed ahead of the coming station. Mason understood that if Logan escaped, he would spend the rest of his life hunting Amelia in retaliation, and might eventually come looking for the hospital where Mason's daughter lay recovering, simply out of spite. For the first time all night, Mason chose to reveal the mark completely instead of hiding it. He pushed his sleeve up past his elbow, no longer concealing anything. The gesture stopped Logan cold. To him, that symbol had always meant something close to a death sentence. Mason told him quietly that he had spared his life once before, back when Logan had not yet chosen the darkness for himself. Tonight, he said, there was still one final second left to choose differently. Logan's arm began to lower, the gun drifting away from Amelia's side, until the train lurched hard beneath them as it began its final approach into the station. He lost his footing and pulled Amelia down with him as he fell. Mason lunged forward, closing the distance in the same unhurried, exact way he had crossed every other distance that night, as though speed had never been the point, only precision. Amelia felt herself pulled sideways as Logan's grip loosened, and for one long, suspended second the entire car seemed to hold its breath along with her. The section ended on a single sharp gunshot cutting through the darkened car. After the shot rang out, everyone in the car assumed for a terrible moment that either Amelia or Mason had been hit. When the emergency lighting steadied, Logan was the one on the floor, his wrist locked in Mason's grip, a single bullet buried harmlessly in the ceiling above them. Mason had redirected the barrel in the exact instant Logan's finger closed on the trigger. Amelia was pulled clear behind Mason, shaken and bruised but otherwise unharmed. Logan, restrained now and breathing hard, asked Mason why he had spared his life all those years ago at the port. Mason answered that he remembered Logan kneeling beside his brother's body that night, weeping, still holding no weapon of his own. He had believed then that a person who could still feel that kind of grief might someday find his way back to something better. The answer broke something loose in Logan. The arrogant, controlled man from the beginning of the evening was gone, replaced by someone confronting, in real time, just how badly he had wasted a life he had once been given back. Elijah finally regained contact with his support team through a signal that cleared as the train slowed. Emergency brakes engaged and officers were already gathering along the platform ahead. Jackson made one last attempt to reach a fallen weapon lying near the aisle. Amelia was the one who spotted the movement first and called out a warning to Mason. Mason kicked the weapon well out of reach and pinned Jackson to the floor without inflicting any further injury, a small but telling detail that reinforced everything the car had already learned about him that night. His danger came from control, not from any hunger for violence. Amelia handed the real encrypted drive over to Elijah once the train came to a full stop. Logan understood, sitting there in restraints, that the entire network he had spent years building had ended in the space of a single evening. Before he was led away, though, he said one thing that left the whole car stunned into silence: that Mason had never simply been a soldier in that unit. He had been the one commanding the mission that the underworld still spoke of, decades later, in careful whispers. Amelia looked at Mason and understood, in that single sentence, that the man who had been forced to give up his seat at the start of the night had, in fact, been the most dangerous person in the entire car all along. She thought back to how easily she had dismissed him at the start of the journey, filing him away in her mind as simply another tired stranger with nowhere important to be, and felt a small, quiet shame at how wrong that first impression had turned out to be. Officers moved through the car in careful lines, collecting weapons, separating the injured from the merely frightened, and asking questions that Mason answered with as few words as possible, offering nothing more than what the situation strictly required. Once the platform settled into its slow, exhausted aftermath, Mason did not celebrate anything. He simply knelt again, this time to gather the crumpled hospital papers that had been kicked and scattered earlier in the night. He asked Elijah quietly whether he could leave right away, since he still needed to reach the hospital before the scheduled surgery began. Elijah wanted to keep him for a formal statement, but Amelia stepped in and used what influence she had to arrange an escort that would get Mason to the hospital in time regardless of the paperwork still waiting to be filed. Mason refused any praise offered to him. He said simply that he had done what needed doing, nothing more, and clearly wanted no further attention drawn to it. Amelia understood, watching him gather his things in silence, that his fear had never truly been of armed men or violence. His fear was that his old identity might resurface and unravel the private, careful life he had built for himself and his daughter. Elijah promised that Mason's name would stay out of any public report, listed only as a passenger who had assisted in restraining a suspect, nothing further. Yet before being taken away, Logan managed to pass a quiet word to a corrupt officer nearby, letting slip that Mason Carter was still alive. It was a small, dangerous seed planted deliberately, leaving the story without any sense of full and final closure. Mason arrived at the hospital not long after. There was no need to linger on the child directly. It was enough to see the pale, sterile hallway, the closed door of the operating room, and Mason's own hand pressing down to sign the consent form waiting for him. He did not weep in front of anyone in that hallway, but his hand trembled slightly as he signed his name, a small and private crack in the composure he had carried through everything that came before it. Amelia arrived some time later, standing at a respectful distance, careful not to intrude on something that belonged entirely to him and no one else. She watched the same man who had just taken down an entire crew of armed criminals reduced now to something far simpler. A father hoping, more than anything else in the world, that his phone would not ring with bad news. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the particular hum that seemed to exist only in hospitals at that hour, when the rest of the world had gone quiet and only the people waiting for news remained fully awake. Nurses passed with quiet, practiced efficiency, none of them aware of what the man sitting near the window had done only hours earlier, none of them needing to know, since none of it mattered here in the way it had mattered on the train. Mason sat with his hands folded, elbows resting on his knees, staring at a door that would not open for hours yet, and found himself thinking not of Logan or Jackson or the smoke-filled car, but only of a small hospital bracelet and the sound of a nurse's voice telling him to hold on just a little longer. A few days later, Logan Hunter was formally charged, and the laundering network he had built for years collapsed entirely once Amelia's evidence and Elijah's testimony reached the right hands. Jackson Reed and the rest of the crew were arrested soon after, and the corrupt officer who had tried to sell information about Mason's identity found himself under investigation as well, his own choices catching up with him faster than he expected. Amelia Grace found Mason at a small diner near the hospital, choosing the quiet setting deliberately, away from anything that might draw attention. She had not come to repay him with money. Instead, she offered him a position as an anonymous security consultant for her company, one that required no public appearances, no press, and no disruption to the ordinary life he had worked so hard to protect. Mason turned her down at first, unwilling to step back into anything resembling his old world. Amelia told him plainly that she did not need a weapon. She needed someone who understood exactly when not to use one. The sentence landed somewhere deep in Mason, because it named the very thing he had spent years trying to protect in himself. Elijah joined them briefly and confirmed that Mason's old service record remained sealed untouched and unlikely to surface publicly. To the wider world, he would remain simply an ordinary man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Mason received word not long after that his daughter's surgery had gone well. There was no need to show her directly. A short phone call and the quiet, overwhelmed stillness that crossed Mason's face said everything that mattered. He sat down at the small table in the diner and, for what felt like the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to exhale. Amelia glanced at his wrist, now covered again by his sleeve, and asked whether he regretted letting Logan see the mark hidden beneath it. Mason said he did not. Some things are not buried to disappear forever, he told her. They are buried so that they only surface again when someone innocent truly needs protecting. The story circled back, quietly, to the seat that had started everything. At the beginning of the night, Logan had forced Mason to give it up as an act of humiliation. Now, in this small diner, Amelia pulled out a chair and offered it to him instead, a small gesture that carried far more weight than either of them said aloud. Mason was no longer a man forced to stand. He had become at last a man who chose for himself exactly when to rise. Outside the diner window, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to what had happened aboard a train just days earlier, and Mason found a strange comfort in that indifference, in the knowledge that ordinary life would simply fold back around him if he let it. He picked up the chair Amelia had offered, sat down fully this time, and allowed himself, if only for the length of one quiet cup of coffee, to simply be a father again, and nothing else. There are men who look perfectly ordinary simply because they grew tired long ago of proving how dangerous they truly were. Mason Carter never needed to boast about his past, never needed to recount old victories, never needed to play the hero in front of a crowd. All he ever wanted was a quiet seat, a train headed toward a hospital, and one more chance to be a father for another day. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not mistake gentleness for fear, and never force a man who has already buried a war inside his own chest to rise up and fight it all over again, because when he finally does, the ones who pushed him there will understand, far too late, exactly what they woke up. If the story of Mason Carter has left you curious, stay close for what comes next, when the world finally learns who sold out his Black Ops secret.